Hello, my name is Giorgio Shani, and today I will be presenting on From Liberal Peacebuilding to the Local Turn. It will be based in large part on Chapter 4 of Rethinking Peace, Discourse, Memory, Translation, and Dialogue, edited by Alex Hinton, Jeremiah Alberg, and myself. The chapter is entitled Saving Liberal Peacebuilding from the Local Turn to a Post-Western Peace. Now, last week, within the course Peace and Conflict Studies 1, and also in Development, Conflict and Peacebuilding, I introduced you to the main components of liberal peacebuilding. And we reviewed Roland Paris's reading, Saving Liberal Peacebuilding. So today we will be critically examining liberal peacebuilding, and I will pay particular attention to the development of literature on local ownership and post-liberal or hybrid perspectives on peacebuilding, which can be encompassed in the generic term, the local turn. And we will be posing the question whether the local turn can be seen as a challenge or continuation of a liberal peacebuilding. In other words, does the local turn provide an alternative to liberal peacebuilding? Or, as Roland Paris suggested in his reading, is there any alternative to liberal peacebuilding? Okay, let us start. So I will start by posing the question, is liberal peacebuilding dead? And this certainly seems to be the consensus following the cataclysmic political changes which have been experienced, particularly in the West, but internationally or globally during the past 5 years or so. There has certainly been a retreat from liberal internationalist ideas in the West. We can see this specifically with the election of President Donald Trump and his nationalist agenda, which is based upon making America great again, and its consequences for America's relationships with its partners and its participation within international institutions. And also, if we look at the other major state, with all due respect to Australia, in the Anglosphere, the United Kingdom, we have seen a retreat from ideas of liberal institutionalism as characterized by the European Union and Britain's decision to unilaterally leave the European Union, Brexit. Allied to this, we have seen the rise of what I would like to term the post-Western world, specifically those societies affiliated with the BRICS, of which the People's Republic of China, India, Brazil, and Russia are important members. So economically, we have seen the contestation of the hegemony of the West by the rise of the People's Republic of China. And economically, we have seen the emergence of India, and politically, we have seen resurgence of Russia particularly under President Vladimir Putin. This gives rise to a question which was first raised by Oliver Richmond over a decade ago on whether liberal peace can be seen as a post-liberal peace. So his argument was, even at the time in which Roland Paris was heading his defense of liberal peacebuilding in Saving Liberal Peacebuilding, Richmond, based on work on the ground in different post-conflict societies, thought that liberal peace-building projects were not being implemented according to the blueprint of liberal peacebuilding, but could now be seen as part of a post-liberal peace, which is characterized by what Richmond and McGinty have termed the local turn. So by the local turn, we can encompass the variety or the myriad practices of local ownership, of local mediation, of local peace building, which make up the local turn and are seen to constitute either an alternative to or an amelioration on, an improvement on the ideals of the liberal peace. Let us briefly review what is meant by the liberal peace. As I mentioned in previous lectures, the liberal peace is based on the post-Cold War convergence of conflict management and conflict resolution, which were seen as two different paradigms. Conflict management seeking to enforce a negative peace, and conflict resolutions seeking to provide for a positive peace. So these conflict management and conflict resolution approaches were mapped out in 1992 by Boutros Boutros-Ghali's Agenda for Peace, which is associated with the revival of the activism of the United Nations. So the United Nations was paralyzed for the first, arguably 50 years, or at least 45 years of its existence by the Cold War and the use of the veto by both the United States and its allies and the Soviet Union. So the collapse of the Soviet Union led to a revival of UN activism. The United Nations was in a position to realize the objectives set out in the charter, in its charter. Now, associated with this, but not directly following from this, was the increasing involvement of international financial institutions and non-governmental organizations in the governance of conflict-ridden societies. Now, as previously mentioned, one component of the liberal peace, which we would look at later, is economic liberalization and the triumph, in a way, of market supply-side economics. This is associated with high interest rates. Now, during the 1980s, right up to the 1990s, we find a net outflow of capital from developing societies to developed societies in the form of interests on debt, interest on loans, which had been taken out to facilitate development projects during the era of post-independence economic development, characterized by the role of the state and what we term Keynesian demand-centered economic strategies. So what we find is, as a result of the debt crisis, many societies in the developing world were unable to pay back the interest on their loans. And this afforded international financial institutions more of a role in economic policy. And they used this role in economic policy to insist on structural adjusted policies, which were designed to lead to the creation of a market economy. Now, this also impacted on the capacity of the state to meet the welfare needs of its population, to provide for welfare provisions, and in some cases, education and basic human needs such as food and access to sanitation and safe drinking water. So increasingly, non-governmental organizations, some of whom were registered internationally in Western societies and responsible to their donors, stepped into this vacuum to meet the welfare needs of citizens and to provide for needs which could not be left to market forces. So what this means is basically within indebted societies, a shift from state sovereignty to market economics and to an entrenched role of non-governmental organization in providing welfare. The emphasis of liberal peace building is upon state building. So without a state, without a Leviathan, there can be no security. There can be no peace. So in this sense, state building is necessary for the maintenance of a negative. This emphasis upon state building, however, was characterized by the establishment of liberal democratic institutions, which were considered necessary for the functioning of a stable market economy, which would lead to increased prosperity. So peace was a necessary precondition for prosperity, and prosperity led to a more sustainable peace. Now, this is based on the so-called democratic peace thesis, which for a short period of time in the discipline of international relations in the 1990s achieved the status of a theorem or even a law. This stated that no two liberal democratic societies had gone to war with each other. So examples can be France and Germany, which had been to war with each other from 1870 to 1945 3 times, when they did not both have liberal democratic institutions. Following the defeat of Nazi Germany and its transformation into liberal democracy, we find that relations between France and Germany have improved to such an extent that they share a common foreign policy within the framework of the European Union. Another example would be relations between the United States and Japan, since the occupation of Japan transformed Japan into a liberal democracy. We have found more than 75 or 70 years, arguably 75 years of peaceful relations between the United States and Japan. The corollary, or the flip side to the democratic peace thesis, is of course that liberal democratic states have gone to war with opposing states, with authoritarian state structures, with fascist states, with socialist communist states, and arguably with other types of democracies such as Islamic democracies. So the argument is that the best guarantee of peaceful relations, of a perpetual peace in Immanuel Kant's terms, or everlasting peace, is for states to be liberal democratic. And a stable market economy was seen as a precondition for the maintenance of these liberal democratic institutions. This became, as we saw earlier, the blueprint for the post-conflict reconstruction of societies as diverse as Cambodia, Bosnia, Kosovo, Sierra Leone, Liberia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and East Timor. It was also implemented in Afghanistan and Iraq as part of the War on Terror, although, as Roland Paris mentions in his reading, Saving Liberal Peacebuilding, the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan and Iraq cannot be seen as part of liberal peacebuilding strategies, since liberal peacebuilding refers to international intervention led by the United Nations in conflict societies or in post-conflict societies. So it doesn't always follow occupation. So Afghanistan and Iraq can be seen as part of the War on Terror. The War on Terror for Paris is not necessarily seen as part of liberal peacebuilding strategies. However, the same blueprint was implemented in Afghanistan and Iraq, a commitment to the establishment of liberal democratic institutions and the freeing up of the economy, the liberalization of the economy, the implementation of structural adjusted policies, particularly with respect to oil in the case of Iraq. As we looked at last time, liberal peacebuilding is characterized by security sector reform, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration programs, which are expected to be implemented by the state with the assistance of the international community, democratization or political liberalization, which is characterized by an explicit commitment to building liberal democratic institutions, constitutionally guaranteed rights, and competitive multi-party elections, economic liberalization, which is characterized by market reforms designed to facilitate a free flow of goods and services instituted, often coercively, through the IMF World Bank structural adjusted policies. Coercively, by coercively here, I mention that the IMF and World Bank very often takes over, or in some occasions takes over, the running of the economy of heavily indebted societies. And transitional justice mechanisms. Now, transitional justice mechanisms do not necessarily flow from the logic of liberal peacebuilding. However, the argument here with transitional justice mechanisms is they may be seen as attempts at reconciliation between warring parties or perpetrators and victims through legal framework. And if we look at liberalism as a political ideology or as a project, then liberalism is based, in the words of John Locke, in a belief in freedom. And freedom for Locke was to have a standing rule to live by. This standing rule to live by is translated into a commitment to the rule of law. So transitional justice mechanisms can be seen as attempts made at reconciling warring parties or perpetrators and victims through truth and reconciliation committees, or transitional justice mechanisms in some, but not all, post-conflict societies. So we looked at many examples of this which diverge from the ICTY in the former Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, the Gacaca tribunals in Rwanda, to the ECCC in Cambodia. Now, so far, I have merely gone through the main components of liberal peace building, which should be familiar to all of you, particularly those who attended the lecture on liberal peace building. What I intend to do now would be to briefly go through the critique of liberal peace building. The critique of liberal peace building, which Roland Paris in his reading himself critiqued. Firstly, let us look at SSR, security sector reforms. A critique of security sector reforms is that rather than leading to the establishment of peaceful, liberal democratic societies, SSSR has strengthened the coercive capacity of the state at the expense of civil society. If we look at liberalism there as a political ideology or as a project, there is a distinction made between the public and the private, between the realm of the state and civil society. Civil society is that area of public life which is independent of the state, which is not controlled by the state. Well, what we've seen with the implementation of SSSR is that it has, in many post-conflict societies, strengthened the state apparatus itself. Much aid has gone to police forces, to the military, to the extraction of taxation, for example. This has stunted the development of civil society organizations and led to what may be termed a greater securitization of society as a whole. The commitment to democratization, political liberalization, in the face of this strengthened coercive capacity of the state, sometimes appears to be a sham or a fraud. Sometimes it appears to legitimize these strengthened state structures. So elections, when they are held, either are met with widespread violence, fraud, or voter apathy. So we can see widespread violence in societies such as Kenya and others when there is a contestation of the legitimacy of the election result. In a different area, we can talk in terms of Belarus, which is not seen as a post-conflict society, but here we have democratization or elections being held, but at the same time, these elections have led to the return of the governing party and the re-election of the president, yet this has been contested. And although most of the protests have been themselves peaceful. They have been met often with a violent response from the security services. Democratization has been characterized by fraud in many societies, particularly if we look at Afghanistan. After the elections or the re-election of President Karzai, we find that there was many cases documented by electoral observers and by the United Nations of electoral fraud and of multiple ballots being cast by individual voters. Or political liberalization is sometimes met with voter apathy, with low turnout, or even where there is high turnout, we find a reluctance a reluctant acceptance of the status quo. A good example here would, in a way, be Cambodia, where you have had numerous attempts by opposition governments, by opposition parties to challenge the reign of Hun Sen. Hun Sen has ruled Cambodia ever since the Vietnamese invasion or liberation of Cambodia in 1979. Now, the fact that Hun Sen has still managed to cling to power despite many, I wouldn't say electoral reverses, but many electoral contestations, has led to voter apathy as opposition candidates are either bought off or intimidated into accepting the prevalence of Hun Sen's rule. The critique of economic liberalization may be seen to parallel the critique of security sector reform. Whereas security sector reform strengthens the coercive capacity of the state, economic liberalization has weakened the state. It's weakened its economic functions by undermining its capacity to intervene in the market to ensure employment, rights, or prevent capital flight. An infamous example of this would perhaps be the involvement of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank in the economic liberalization of post-conflict societies such as Mozambique and Angola. Particularly if we look at Mozambique, both Mozambique and Angola were governed by rebel organizations which had successfully fought the Portuguese colonial rule. And after the 1974 coup in Portugal, then had to fight against Renamo and UNITA, which were both backed by South Africa during the apartheid era. So after the victory of Frelimo and the MPLA in the civil wars, both of these organizations were committed to a form of Marxism. We found that the heavy indebted nature of the economy meant that they had to rely on IMF loans. IMF World Bank loans, which were provided by the IMF. These World Bank loans were provided on the basis that there would be structural adjusted policies, which not only weakened the state's capacity to intervene in the market, but led to widespread unemployment, led to widespread poverty as a result also of DDR programs, the demobilization of many members of the army. And at the same time, much of this capital was went overseas. I think we have an infamous example in the case of Angola, where we have the daughter of President dos Santos, who has been accused of, allegedly, she has been accused of misappropriating many of the assets of Angola. And she is actually one of Africa's wealthiest women. Where has most of this money gone? Well, most of this money has gone outside of Angola, much of it in the United Kingdom, where she lives. Finally, if we look at transitional justice mechanisms, many transitional justice mechanisms reopen the wounds of a conflict, leading to a return to conflict. So transitional justice mechanisms can be seen to in many cases, inhibit the efforts at reconciliation by reopening these wounds, reopening memories, which themselves can be politicized. So transitional justice mechanisms directly relate here to democratization and political liberalization. So if you have attempts to mobilize communities electorally based on a particular ideology, or based on a particular ethnicity or particular religion, then this inhibits or hinders the ability of or attempts at reconciliation between perpetrators and victims. In other words, if the party of victims, such as the party of we look at Rwanda, we find the mobilization of Tutsis under President Kagame in a way may inhibit the attempts at reconciliation between Tutsis and Hutus. I should mention, however, that Kagame's state-run attempts at reconciliation, not only through Gacaca, but through other policies, have attempted to outlaw the use of both terms Tutsi and Hutu, and to create a Rwandan identity, although a Rwandan identity very much with a Tutsi core. This basically is a summary of the critique of liberal peace building. Let us look at the local turn. Well, if we are to summarize the main crux of the critique on liberal peace building, then we find that there is criticism made for its highly interventory nature, its hierarchical, top-down, institutional, neoliberal, and certainly in the case of Iraq and Afghanistan, neo-colonial overtones. It is the United Nations and its backers in Western societies or heavily industrial societies, in highly industrialized societies, telling local people in conflict-ridden societies or in post-conflict societies what to do, how to organize their economies, how to organize their polities. When in many, if not a majority of the cases, the causes of the conflict to begin with were exacerbated by external intervention, particularly during the Cold War. The main argument here is that local people have been denied agency, have been denied a role in the rebuilding of their own societies by liberal peace building. It's a package, one size fits all package. State elites are often answerable primarily to the international community rather than their own citizens. This can be seen through low voter turnout and widespread. The emphasis of the local turn is on local ownership. It's on the emancipation, the freeing, and the empowerment of local actors so that they are in a position to make choices on their own behalf. So a pluralist, critical, and self-reflexive approach is sought, which goes beyond liberal peace building and works within local structures, within local power structures. But what do we mean by the local? Well, for McGinty and Richmond, the local refers to the range of locally based agencies present within a conflict and post-conflict environment, some of which are aimed at identifying and creating the necessary processes for peace, perhaps with or without international help, and framed in a way in which legitimacy in local and international terms converges. The peace which results from this convergence of legitimacy in local and international terms, this peace which results from engagement with the local, can be seen as an everyday type of peace, an everyday, quotidian, and emancipatory, liberation, emancipatory type, in which authority, rights, redistribution, and legitimacy are slowly rethought and are reflected in institutional and international architecture. And it's here perhaps we can return to our example of the Gacaca tribunals. So there is an international criminal tribunal, like for Yugoslavia, for Rwanda. It was set up at the same time as the ICTY. However, it was felt that the prosecution of leaders of the Hutu militias for the genocide inflicted upon the Tutsi population in 1994 was in many sense counterproductive, particularly since many of these leaders were resident in other societies, particularly in the Democratic Republic of Congo. However, in every village or in every town within Rwanda, not just in the capital city of Kigali, there were perpetrators and victims of the genocide living side by side. So the Gacaca tribunals can be an attempt at a transitional justice mechanism which works through a commitment to a local institution, here Gacaca, where you had these mass trials and attempts at reconciliation rather than criminal prosecution through a legal code. Another example of local peace-building mechanisms would be in a state such as Afghanistan, a post-conflict state, at least after the occupation of the United States, a return to traditional conflict resolution mechanisms or institutional authorities such as the lawyer Giorgio. In Nepal, it will be the panchayat systems. So panchayats can be seen as village level, in many senses, democratic structures or village level structures which provide governance for local communities. So there are many examples of these local mechanisms. The idea is that international peace builders work through these mechanisms. So donors work through local mechanisms. The United Nations works through these local mechanisms and gives them legitimacy. Even though they're not formally part of the state, by receiving aid, by being recognized as institutional structures, these local structures gain international legitimacy. And at the same time, the intervention by the international community through these local structures also gains legitimacy. It seems less like an intervention and more like assistance. Now, having been introduced to liberal peace building and the local turn, I turn now to a critique of the local turn within the context of a challenge to liberal peace building. So on the one hand, I argue that the local turn, as exemplified in the work of Oliver Richmond, Roger McGinty, Caroline Hughes, etc., constitutes a welcome departure from Eurocentric grand narratives. These Eurocentric grand narratives can be seen in terms of liberal peace building. The idea that freedom can be bestowed through intervention, through well-meaning intervention and through structural adjusted policies, which are designed to create autonomous individuals who are free, who are unattached or unencumbered by superstition or by local traditions which inhibit their freedom. So ideas of freedom can be seen as a grand narrative. The idea that once people were in chains, but then they are liberated, they see the light. This is the idea of the Enlightenment, Lumiere. Now, these grand narratives tend to come from Europe. So even though we find a commitment to liberty, to freedom, to equality at the heart of many international institutions, and that they have been embraced by most states within the world, not just Western states, but more particularly republics such as the People's Republic of China or even the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. These grand narratives have come from somewhere. These grand narratives have come from Europe, and specifically the Europe of the Enlightenment. So Even though this local turn is a welcome departure from these Eurocentric grand narratives, it reproduces liberal assumptions about peace building. Liberal peace building, again, to return to Paris, this is a point he makes, is critiqued on liberal grounds as being narrow and exclusionary. So it's not a critique of liberal peace building. It's not a critique of liberal democratic institutions. It's a critique of these liberal democratic institutions and a critique of liberal peace as not being liberal enough, not being exclusionary, excluding some sections of society, particularly those sections of society who are not familiar with ideas such as rights, such as the rule of law. So it's a way of expanding the liberal assumptions of liberal peace building by making them more accessible to people in different societies who may have different views or different cultures. A good example here perhaps would be a commitment to gender emancipation. So if you're going to be looking at, let's say, women's empowerment and emancipation in a very conservative patriarchal society, then using terms such as women's rights may be exclusionary. It may exclude people you're trying to meet, women who work and operate within a heavily patriarchal society. So it needs, this message of empowerment and freedom needs to be translated in such a way that it resonates with them. It's not seen as something which is coming from the outside. It's something which enables them to go to school, which enables them to start businesses, to go to work. So on the one hand, these emancipatory approaches to peace fail to engage with local target populations in their own terms and thus build legitimate institutions. Whereas on the other, attempts to build a post-liberal hybrid peace appear to reify the local as a space distinct from the global or international, and ignores the role which colonialism played in the construction of such spaces. This is the crux of the argument. So what I'm saying is that emancipatory approaches to peace fail to engage with local target populations in their own terms. So if we go back to the example of women's empowerment within heavily patriarchal societies, there is still at the heart of the local turn or post-liberal peace building a belief in a universal international notion of women's rights, of gender empowerment, which can be adapted to local traditions and translated into vernaculars, into local vernacular context, cultural and linguistic contexts. The point I'm trying to make is that if genuinely we're looking at attempts at bottom-up or local peace building, we have to start with the local communities themselves. We have to start with their understanding of women's rights, of the role of women within a particular society, with the women's ideas in a particular patriarchal society of their role, rather than international standard gender mainstreaming and attempting to take these ideas and apply them to a particular society. So a bottom-up approach would start from women within a deeply patriarchal society and posed the question, what do they understand by freedom? What do they understand by emancipation? Rather than have the message translated in to their vernaculars coming from the outside. On the other hand, attempts to build a post-liberal hybrid peace appear to reify the local. Reification here, to reify the local, means you create this space called the local. The local is seen as distinct from somewhere which is not the local. So where is not the local? The global or the international. But what is the global or the international? Who speaks for the global or the international? Well, the United Nations speaks for the global or the international. Non-governmental organizations speak for the global or the international. International financial institutions speak for the global or the international. But this space of the global and the international is one which excludes local people themselves. It excludes what is called local people because there is no space called the local. The space called the local was itself a construction of global processes such as colonialism and such as capitalism, the creation of a global market economy. So it is colonialism itself which creates these spaces. And I think at the very heart of this critique, the sympathetic critique of the local turn, is an assumption that the local itself is a term which can be applied to the global or the international. So the global or the international can be seen as a Western local. It comes from somewhere. It comes from these Eurocentric grand narratives, which emanate from a particular place at a particular time. So in other words, liberalism itself is local. We cannot say that liberalism is a global ideology. It came from somewhere and it emerged at some time. It can be seen as universal or universalizable. We can make it universal, but at the same time, it is not universal. It did not develop everywhere at the same time. Okay, this sort of concludes my intervention in the field of peace and conflict studies, and particularly on the distinction between liberal peace building and the local turn. I very briefly want to look at the idea of conflict transformation. We do not have much time to engage with the ideas of conflict transformation, but there is many similarities between ideas of post-liberal hybrid peace building and what can be seen as the elicitive approach taken by John Paul Lederach. So it's based on the assumption, which actually Johan Galtung in his earlier readings also suggests that conflict is inevitable. It's part of the realist notion of international relations. This is premised on the inevitability of conflict. And the conflict is inevitable because it arises from unequal power structures and also arises from this insatiable appetite for power. Power is seen as a finite resource. However, violence is not inevitable. Personal violence or even structural violence is not inevitable. And conflict transformation is a way of transforming violent conflict, personal, structural, into something else. So conflict transformation accepts conflict and says that transforming conflict can allow us to envision and respond to the ebb and flow of social conflict as life-giving opportunities for creating constructive change processes that reduce violence, increase justice in direct interaction and social structures, and respond to real-life problems in human relationships. So I'd like to suggest here that there are many similarities with McGinty and Richmond's conception of the hybrid peace. Now, I think it is appropriate to look at two questions for discussion. The first, which arises from Roland Paris's article, is whether liberal peace building should be safe. Should liberal peace building be safe? And the second would be whether the local turn constitutes a challenge or continuation of liberal peace building. Let us look at the possible responses. We look at liberal peace building, then the argument which Paris has made, and certainly which advocates of liberal peace building, which has been the hegemonic response to conflict, certainly within the last 20 to 30 years, the response would be that liberal peace building has done more good than harm. Yes, it has imperfections. Yes, it may lead to voter apathy. It may lead in the short term to employment or to job losses, or may lead to electoral violences. However, the failure of the existing peace-building project, in which the United Nations and non-governmental organizations, as well as local actors, are committed, would be tantamount, in Paris's words, to abandoning tens of millions of people to lawlessness, predation, disease, and fear. No intervention would lead to a case like Rwanda. So what Paris is setting up here is a comparison here between, let's say, Rwanda and Kosovo. So in Rwanda, no liberal peace building, no intervention. We have a genocide in which 800,000 people die within 6 weeks. Within Kosovo, we have perhaps certainly examples of ethnic cleansing, which could have led to a genocide, but a decisive action on behalf of the international community by NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And this eventually led to Kosovo's independence and to liberal democratic structures being implemented, no matter how imperfect, and to peaceful relations between Kosovo and its neighbors once Serbia, which Kosovo was an integral part before the breakup of Yugoslavia. Serbia also democratized. It was democratic before under Slobodan Milosevic, but it was certainly not a liberal democracy. So democratized in the sense of developing liberal institutions to go with multi-party elections. So the idea here is that peace building, liberal peace building has done more good than harm. The argument which critics of liberal peace buildings have made is that liberal peace building has done more harm than good. From the perspective of the local turn, it can be seen as a continuation of a neo-colonial project that seeks to exert hegemony, control over post-colonial societies. So local resistance to liberal peace building is emphasized. So here, rather than local resistance, perhaps I should say there isn't local alternative to liberal peace building. We can identify local traditions and local actors, and there should be more local ownership of the peace building process. If we look at the local turn, does this constitute a challenge or a continuation of liberal peace building? Here we see the local as a site of resistance to this neo-colonial top-down hierarchical project of liberal peace building. The liberal peace, through the engagement of the local, is transformed into a post-liberal hybrid peace, which is sufficiently sensitized, meaning made sensitive to local alterity. Local alterity here means otherness, notions of the other, to local identities, local cultures, local customs. This makes it legitimate. So rather than talking in terms of peace building, theorists who work within the myriad of different approaches which can be subsumed under the category of the local would argue instead for peace formation. So peace formation, just like state formation, if we look at state building literature. So peace formation constructs emancipatory projects in local languages. So emancipatory projects here means projects which are designed to emancipate people, liberate people from freedom, from despair, from structures of unequal power. It seeks to do this working through local languages, languages in a conceptual sense, not just in the sense of a language which we will speak. On the other hand, it can be argued that the local turn can be seen or can be seen as a continuation of liberal peace buildings, because liberal peace building is critiqued on liberal grounds as narrow and as exclusionary. We see this in Richmond's understanding of peace formation as constructing emancipatory projects. Well, where does this idea of emancipatory come from? It comes from the idea of emancipation. And emancipation comes from the idea of a universal understanding of freedom. People can be emancipated. They can be freed. It's always somebody freeing others. So it's a universal idea here, emancipation. So liberal peace building is critiqued on liberal grounds. It shares a commitment to emancipation and empowerment. Empowerment is to make people see the choices which are available to them so that they can take decisions on their own behalf. Again, there's a hierarchical component here. It's a top-down component. Localization, the local turn, or local ownership, therefore entails the translation of liberal normative values, which are seen as universal, into the vernacular. So the vernacular here means local customs. Doesn't necessarily mean a local dialect. That's what we understand by vernacular, local dialect or local language. But here the local turn serves to mainstream liberal ideas and to make them accessible to populations who live in so-called local areas, populations who do not accept or relate to these so-called universal ideas of liberalism. So localization entails the translation of liberal normative values into the vernacular. Okay, I hope you have enjoyed this lecture. The three readings, essential readings, which form the basis of this lecture are McGinty and Richmond's The Local Turn in Peacebuilding, A Critical Agenda for Peace, Roland Paris's Saving Liberal Peacebuilding, and my chapter in Rethinking Peace, Saving Liberal Peacebuilding, from the local turn to a post-Western peace. Okay, thank you very much for listening.